Hello everybody, Timothy here for part 2 of my Shadows over Innistrad limited review. Again, this is limited only, so if a card really stands out for standard, I might mention it, but that's really not the goal here. I plan on doing pre-releases, I plan on drafting this set a lot, so this is to get the juices flowing. We already looked at the white cards, so if you check that out, thank you. And thank you for watching this video. These videos are a little bit longer than some of the other set reviews, just on account of how long the or how big the set is in general. So if you're watching, I appreciate it, and we're going to go ahead and move right along. Looking at part 2 of our Vessel cycle, we get Vessel of Paramecia. This is a 2-mana enchantment. Doesn't do anything when it comes down. None of the Vessels do. But you can invest 1 mana, 1 blue, sacrifice the Vessel, put 3 cards from the top of target player's library into their graveyard, and then draw a card. This is nice because it cantrips itself. It is 3 mana total, but you get to split it up over a couple turns. So if you don't have a 2-drop or you don't have a turn 2 creature, this is a nice card to get on the battlefield and get going when you have the extra mana for it. And it will replace itself by drawing a card. Now this could mill your opponent. There are only a couple mill cards and not very many to the point where mill is a viable strategy in this set. So you'll be often using this to mill yourself to try and enable Delirium. And this is nice because it gets an enchantment in there by yourself, and you're very likely to hit a creature and a land. So you're down to maybe 1 more card to get in before you hit Delirium. This can let you hit turn 3 Delirium pretty reliably. So I like the card, and I think if you have a lot of Delirium cards, you want to pick this up. If you don't, I don't really see too much of a use for it. It goes good with graveyard shenanigans, but other than Delirium and graveyard things, there's not very much use for this. You're not going to be aiming it at your opponent very often. Deny Existence is a 3-mana counterspell, an instant. Well, obviously an instant counterspell. If counter target creature spell, if that spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it in the owner's graveyard. Sorry for the slip up there. So it's a creature counter spell only, like an Essence Scatter, and it exiles it. The exile clause is nice. These dissipate type effects that make sure your opponent's not getting value from the graveyard when you exile the creature is nice. But 3 mana is already a lot for counter spells. I'm not a big fan of cancel. I'm not a huge fan of counter spells in general when it comes to limited, unless I board them in against things I just can't beat. The exile is a nice upside, but not enough for me to play a narrow counter spell like this. This only hits creatures, and that's kind of what puts me off from it. So I think it's fine if you're into counter spells, but me personally, I would cut it most of the time. Follow that up with Drownyard Explorers. This is a 4-mana 2/4. When it enters the battlefield, investigate. So not an exciting card, but it is a common. You will play it in most of your blue decks. You might even play multiple copies. It's basically a 2/4 that draws a card later in the game. You might think of it as a 6-mana 2/4 if you need that card right away. But it's got a little bit of value tacked onto a body that's hard to get through. Spawnbinder Mage in the previous set showed me how well 2/4s match up against the rest of the field when everything's a 2/3 or a 3/2. So I think this card is perfectly playable. A little bit above filler status, but still kind of filler nonetheless. I wouldn't jam all of them into my deck because it is a 4-mana creature, and you can do better for 4 mana, but this is fine on its own. Ghostly Wings is a 2-mana enchantment aura. Enchant creature. The creature that is enchanted gets +1/+1 and flying. Discard a card, return enchanted creature to its owner's hand. So I'm not in love with this, but it is pretty neat. Again, this is kind of a... I guess the idea here is that by discarding a card and returning the creature to your hand, you're sending this enchantment to the graveyard along with another card. So again, this yells at me Delirium Enabler, and of course discard a card means Madness Enabler as well, but like I said last time, whenever you talk about a Madness Enabler, it's going to be equally a Delirium Enabler just because you're sending things from your hand to the graveyard. They work well together. There are times you can put this on your opponent's creature and bounce it, but I don't normally want to discard a card to do that. It is an option. And the +1/+1 in flying is not super strong. We see this type of card actually pretty often, but it usually draws a card. This one discards a card instead, which is useful in certain decks and not in others. But it's flexible. I don't think I'll be playing it very often. I'm not a huge fan of it, but it does quite a bit for one card, and I think that's serviceable enough. Gone Missing is a 5-mana sorcery. Sorcery is pretty important here. Put target permanent on top of its owner's library, then investigate. So this is any permanent. You can, if your opponent's mana screwed, this is a nightmare because you can just toss a land on top of their library. Most of the time you'll be taking a creature and just time walking your opponent, putting it back on top of their deck. This is the type of card you need to be kind of ahead in order to make use of. The Investigate is nice as well, but if you're behind and you just draw this card, all you're doing is making a turn go by. You're going to put their best creature on top of their deck. They're just going to replay it on the following turn, and you still need an answer. Gone Missing, I think you'll play one or two of these in most blue decks, but again, you kind of want to be a tempo deck where you're dealing damage instead of just dirtling along. It's this also plays decently into mill cards, which, like I said, there aren't many of them, but it's kind of like the interaction between Royal Spout and Benthic Infiltrator. You toss their best creature on top of their deck, and then you mill, and it's kind of like removing it. It's kind of long-winded, but Gone Missing is fine. It's a little slow at sorcery speed, but it does have Investigate tacked onto it to give it a little bit of extra value. And I think there are games where this is just going to be annoying for your opponent if you put a completely useless card on top of their library while they're behind. That gives you a pretty big edge. Nagging Thoughts, 2-mana sorcery. Again, sorcery here. Look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the other into your graveyard. Madness this for 2 mana. So first off, this is very bad version of Anticipate. Anticipate is the same mana cost for an instant and lets you look at 3. What this does do nicely is it puts 1 card in the graveyard instead of the bottom of your deck. So you get sorcery into your graveyard, and you also probably get one other type of card in your graveyard. So if you're playing heavy on the Delirium strategy, this might be a card you want. If you have reliable ways to discard this and use it as a madness cost, for its madness cost, that's pretty good. It makes use out of discarding. One really nice thing about madness is if you manage to discard a madness card for a discard, you're actually getting value out of your discard, where normally it would be a card disadvantage. So Nagging Thoughts is fine if you're using it for a reason. As just a random 2-mana filler in blue, you could do a lot better. It's pretty poor card filtering, but it is card filtering nonetheless, and I probably wouldn't go over one of these in most decks. It is worse than Anticipate, and Anticipate usually doesn't get multiple copies in my deck either. Press for Answers. This is 2 mana, and again, sorcery is important here. This type of card is usually an instant, but tap target creature. It doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. Investigate. So this is like a bad Grip of the Royal, or a slightly worse Cripple and Chill for less mana. It is only 2, so you get that clue token out really early. You lock down a problematic creature. But again, this isn't the type of card you want to burn really early in the match anyway. So I like it as kind of a late game way to deal with something for a turn and get a potential draw out of it. I like to think of this as a 4-mana spell instead of a 2-mana spell. 4 mana, tap a creature, draw a card, basically. The best thing here is the Sad Zombie is just ridiculous. But I don't love this card, being sorcery speed. That kind of kills it for me. I don't think I'll play it very often, but if it was instant, I would play it in a heartbeat. But yeah, that's all I have to say for Press for Answers. I think it's fine, but I don't love it. Seagraph Scab, 2 mana 1/3. We've seen these creatures before. They're not particularly good. They're more of a nuisance in the early game than they are a reliable creature. This is a zombie, so if you're playing zombie decks, maybe you want this for some reason, but I certainly don't. Silverland Snapper, 6 mana 6/6 turtle creature. Might as well be a Leviathan, but Silverland Snapper can't attack unless you've cast a non-creature spell this turn. With all these sorceries in blue, that shouldn't be too hard. It shouldn't be too hard in the first place, but sometimes blue struggles with having a late game ender, and I guess this card can be your beatdown in blue. It's not particularly good. It does have a nice body, though. 6/6 is nothing to scoff at, and casting non-creature spells is not something that blue really has trouble with. Plus, this card can still block even if it's not attacking, so it's perfectly serviceable card. I would never want more than one copy of this, and if I had a better beater in my colors, then I would pass on this anyway. But it's there in case you need it, and sometimes you need it. But good luck to you in those games. Stormrider Spirit. This is a 5 mana 3/3 flyer with flash. I stated last time in the white video that these stats for the mana cost is kind of what I'm looking for in a flyer as my floor. I like to get at least 3 power of flying on board for 5 mana. Flash is nice here too. It lets you kind of if your opponent's sending in with a lot of creatures, you can usually eat up their smallest one. If you're playing counterspells, this plays pretty nicely with it. One problem with counterspells is that your opponent doesn't do anything, and suddenly you've wasted your turn. Well, if you have this in hand and 5 open mana, your opponent's going to be reluctant about your counterspells, but you may just put 3 power of flying in play at the end of turn instead, and really get them for holding back. This card is fine. It's not busted. It's very in the middle. It's a very medium card, but it's strong enough that I would play it. Silent Observer is a 4 mana 1/5 flyer. So Ancient Crab grew wings, costs 1 more, slightly easier to cast, but I don't like me Ancient Crab, and I don't particularly like me Silent Observer. Silent Observer is very close to like a Fogbank type creature. It's just going to block anything without really doing much on its own. It attacks every now and then and deals damage, but it's basically a wall. And it's a flying wall, so it's super annoying. It locks down spirit tokens. It locks down 1/1s in general, and it's going to make it hard for your opponent to get through. This is the type of card where if you're playing some long-winded like mill strategy or very late game strategy, or you're looking for a specific card in your deck, you might play a couple of these guys just because they're so hard to get through. But the card doesn't do enough. Ancient Crab was fine, but didn't do enough. Eventually, if you're playing against aggressive opponents, they're going to play more creatures than you, and they're going to be able to get around this. So I don't love the card. I don't think it's good, but it is still playable, and you will play it sometimes, unfortunately. Alright, moving on. Sleep Paralysis, 4 mana aura. Enchanted creature taps. Enchanted creature does not untap during its controller's untap step. So yeah, Claustrophobia, the exact same text. Slightly more expensive in exchange for being single blue instead of double blue, but creature removal nonetheless. This is essentially a 4 mana removal spell. Gets worse if your opponent has blank effects, get worse if your opponent has ways to untap their own creatures, which I don't think there are a lot of, but barring those situations, Sleep Paralysis is a removal spell in blue, and it's a permanent one for the most part, or it will be 80-90% of the time, so I think this is a high pick for blue. You probably won't see these go very late just because it is a decent card. So yeah, I've taken lots of Claustrophobias when I did Origins Draft, and I'll probably take lots of Sleep Paralysis if I end up blue in Shadows over Innistrad. Alright, we get a reprint of Catalog here. That's a 3 mana instant, draw 2, discard a card. So it's a divination. and you're forced to discard a card. There's no way to keep the card like there was with Artificer's Epiphany, but that's still fine. It's card filtering, and it's going to net you even on cards. Along with cataloging the discarded card, you're replacing those with 2 better cards, hopefully. This obviously gains value in a Madness set where discarding a card is useful, or Delirium becomes a little more useful when you have ways to get specific cards into your graveyard. So I would be happy playing 1 or 2 of these. I like instant speed draw spells. It just gives me something to do on my opponent's turn if I don't need to kill a creature. You can always play this at sorcery speed too. It gets a little bit worse, but it's a fine card. I'd be looking to pick one of these up at least. At least one of these anytime I'm playing blue. Jasus Scrutiny. This is 2 mana instant. Target creature gets -4/-0, and you investigate. I don't like this card. I don't think it's very good, but it will win you a combat when you cast it. So it's very easy to kind of lock down a creature, make it a very insignificant creature, and then pick it off if you need to. The investigate is nice as well. If this was just 2 mana, -4/-0 creature and draw a card instead of investigate, I still wouldn't like it. So the fact that this is investigate instead of just a pure cantrip makes me like it even worse. I don't think it's a bad card, but it's not the type of card I love. I don't like picking on one creature to reduce stats. I like to spread it out to the whole team. But if this is what you need to do that trick, then this is fine. Blue doesn't get very many combat warping tricks outside of bounce spells, so this might just be what you need in some situations, and it's fine to throw this in your deck. Just the Wind, 2 mana bounce spell. You can madness it for 1. This can target your own creatures as well. This is a great card. I really love 2 mana bounce spells. In any format that has them, I will pick up a lot of them, up to maybe 3 or 4 in certain decks. They get better when you're doing something with them. If you're just using them defensively and you're kind of behind on board, they get much worse. But if you are managing to attack your opponent reliably, they get much better. They are tempo cards, and the fact that you can madness this for 1 is pretty nice. 1 is not really saving you that much on the 2, but it lets you get value out of discard again, so I love having this option available. It deals with some very problematic cards in the format, like Ormondal, when your opponent sacked 5 creatures and flipped up their 9/7 hasty indestructible lifelink flyer. You can just bounce it for 2 mana, and the day is saved. So having access to this is great, and I really love this sort of card. Moving on to Lamplighter of Self Off. This is a 5 mana 3/5 zombie horror. When it enters the battlefield, if you control another zombie, you may draw and then discard. So a looter if you control another zombie. The body here is fine. It seems like the relative body of the creatures in this set are lower, aside from certain rares and flyers. So if your opponent is playing a ground game, this card will do just fine of locking it down. A lot like Kozilek's Translator or Oracle of Dust. 3/5s are pretty good in a format where the creatures are generally smaller. And the loot effect is just extra if you can pull it off. Zombie is a relevant creature type in this format, so having access to zombies like this seems pretty decent. Niblets of Dusk is a reprint of Jeskai Windscout. It's a 2/1 flyer with prowess. Jeskai Windscout was a fantastic card in Khans of Tarkir. Of course, Khans, the Jeskai tribe was focused on casting non-creature spells, so it's probably easier to trigger prowess multiple times in Khans than it will be this time. But even if you can just beat down for 2 each turn and then maybe 3 on certain turns, this card is pretty good. I think you'll pick up as many of these as possible for your blue decks. It's just a solid, good card. Pieces of the Puzzle, a 3 mana sorcery. Reveal the top 5 cards of your library. Put up to 2 instants and or sorcery cards from among them into your hand. Dump the rest to the graveyard. So you get a graveyard enabler. You're putting a sorcery in by casting this card, and you're dumping at least 3 other cards in. Hopefully you can set up Delirium with this pretty easily if your deck is constructed that way. As for the instants and sorceries, I think this card's pretty poor. There's a chance that it misses. There's a chance that it only gets 1 card. and then it's not fantastic. If you can get 2 cards off of this reliably, then it becomes pretty good, I think. But if you can't, or you're only running a minor number of instants or sorceries, this gets a lot worse. My question is whether or not you would play this only as a Delirium enabler, not really intending to hit instants and sorceries. And my answer to that would be, if you can get at least 1 card of this out of this, and still enable Delirium for your really powerful Delirium abilities, I think this card is fine. There are probably better ways to do it, but this does get a lot of cards into your graveyard while still giving you access to pick up certain cards that you're seeing. I think this card will not make it most of the time, but it's nice to have an option like this in case you're really looking for something like that. Moving on, Stitched Mangalore, 3 mana, 2/3, enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, you freeze an opponent's creature. It doesn't untap until its opponent's next untap step. So I like to think of this as a mix between Frostlynx and Shambling Ghoul, both of which were decent cards. It's more expensive than just a Shambling Ghoul, but it has the same stats, so it's a fine tempo type card. It's not getting through your opponent's 2/3s, it's not getting through their 3/3s, but it does tap something down the turn it comes in, just like Frostlynx, and lets your other creatures get in. The fact that this card enters the battlefield tapped really doesn't do very much. It only makes it kind of a worse play later in the game if your opponent's just swarming you, but this creature's not really attacking, and the fact that it taps an opponent's creature means that it probably doesn't need to block the turn it comes in either, so I think it's fine that this comes in tapped. It's a very minor downside, and I think this card is good. I would happily play a lot of them, at least 2 or 3 of them if I see them, and if I had zombies, I would be looking to pick up as many of these as possible. Furtive Homunculus is a 2 mana, 2/1, and has our new ability Skulk on it. The way Skulk works is a creature with Skulk cannot be blocked by creatures with greater power. So a 2/1 with Skulk cannot be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater, essentially. It's an evasive ability. It's not the same as unblockable. It can still be blocked by 2 power creatures, so it kind of trades evenly or forces your opponent to have smaller creatures. But it's a way of making your early game creatures relevant in the late game. If your opponent is playing bigger and bigger creatures, you still have a way to get in with these smaller Skulk creatures. So I think Furtive Homunculus is fine. If your opponent's playing relatively weak creatures and lots of tokens, it gets a lot worse. But it's a fine card, and it's a nice little showcase for the Skulk ability. Alright, moving into our uncommons, we have a flip card. Daring Sleuth is a 2 mana 2/1, not particularly impressive, but still a bear. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, transform it. So you have to have something that investigates first. This card won't do it on its own, so you need to pair it with something. If you manage to sack the clue while this guy's up, he turns into Bearer of Overwhelming Truths, and apparently finds a bunch of lantern buddies. He becomes a 3/2 instead of a 2/1. Gains prowess, and when he deals combat damage, you investigate. So this card does quite a bit. A 3/2 is not particularly amazing, especially the work you have to put in to flip it. Prowess makes it a little bit better. It lets you beat for a lot, but still means it's probably going to trade with a good number of early game creatures. And the extra ability to investigate anytime it hits your opponent is essentially extra card draw in the long run. So this card starts off very weak. It needs help to flip, since you're going to have to find something else to produce a clue and sack that clue. It takes a little bit of work, but once it flips, you get a creature that's just fine and has the potential to draw you extra cards later in the game. Another flip card, Uninvited Geist, is a 3 mana 2/2, again with Skulk, so it can't be blocked by a creature's power 3 or greater. When Uninvited Geist deals combat damage to a player, transform it, and it turns into Unimpeded Trespasser. This is a 3 3 unblockable creature. Not Skulk, but just straight up unblockable. So this is a huge clock, a very hard to deal with clock that's going to demand an instant or sorcery from your opponent. It's not dying in combat. It hits your opponent for a lot every turn. And if you need it back for a blocker, it's got 3 toughness, which is not irrelevant. The problem is getting this creature in first. It can still be blocked by 1/1s and 2/2s all day long. And it costs more than your average 2/2, so it's going to need some help. You're going to need to do something to make this creature get in for the first time, but the upside is definitely there. If you can force this creature in at least once, then you end up with this clock. This Unimpeded Trespasser is a finisher on its own. These unblockable 3-power creatures are quite good, and I'd be doing everything I can to make sure that the front side gets in before we start beating down with the flip side. Aberrant Researcher, the fate of Delver is continued, I guess, is the idea here. But a 4-mana 3/2 flyer. Beginning of your upkeep, put the top card of your library into your graveyard. If it's an instant or sorcery, transform into a 5/4 flyer. So this seems very strong to me. First off, the base card is a 3/2 flyer for 4, so exactly like Cloud Manta from Battle for Zendikar, and Cloud Manta was actually a very good card in that set. Aberrant Researcher is the same card, but with the ability to turn into a +2/+2 flyer as a 5/4. Now, if you can manage to play this on turn 4 and then flip it on the first turn, it gets to attack on turn 5 for 5 damage, and it's gonna destroy the skies until your opponent gets to their late game flyer or finds a way to deal with this. It's very, very strong card. You do have to be playing lots of instants and sorceries for this to reliably flip, but I think it's fine as just the base. It self-mills yourself if you're looking to do that. Granted, very slowly, but the upside is definitely there, and the base is good enough to play as is. Also, the card just looks horrifying, which is awesome. Alright, moving right along with the uncommons. Ongoing Investigation, a 2-mana enchantment, part of the, I guess, allied color and cycle of enchantments. But whenever one or more creatures you control deals combat damage to a player, investigate. So you're only getting 1 clue regardless of how many creatures get in. But that's pretty nice. You get clue tokens just for dealing damage. So extra card draw in the long run. And then we have an activate ability, 1 in a green. Exile a creature card from your graveyard. Investigate, you gain 2 life. So this is a basically clue enabler. If you have cards that care about clues, or you're just looking to draw lots of cards throughout your game, this will do it for you. Evasive creatures make this better, flyers make it better, but deal damage to get a clue, exile a creature to get a clue. Also, that life gain is not irrelevant. 2 life for each creature that's going to the graveyard that you're able to exile, plus card draw is pretty nice. This is expensive to start getting actual card draw off of. It's 2 to play, 2 to activate, and then 2 to sack your clue, so it does cost a lot of mana investment in the long run, but the output is there. The life gain plus the clue tokens make this card pretty worth it if you're in the colors. I wouldn't go forcing blue or green to make this work, but if you happen to be blue-green, I would happily play this enchantment. Drunau Corpse Trawler is a 4-mana 1/1. This is our little mini-lord for zombies. When he enters the battlefield, you put a 2/2 zombie token onto the battlefield, and then for 3 mana, black and 2 generic, you can give any zombie on the field Death Touch. Very nice card. It gives you 2 bodies, 3 power and 3 toughness for 4 mana is fine, especially spread out across 2 bodies. And if you have that mana open, your opponent's life becomes very miserable. You can just make Death Touchers at will. And this can target any zombie, so the 1/1 body here can gain Death Touch. The token can gain Death Touch. It is a little bit pricey, so you probably won't be given multiple things Death Touch in a turn, but do you really need to do that? Probably not. This card discourages your opponent from attacking into your open mana and makes it quite easy for you to trade up on creatures. Menak Scribe, part of our Delirium cycle. I don't think I mentioned this last time, but Topplegeist was the white part of this cycle where creatures have an effect and then they repeat that effect when you enable Delirium. But Here we have a 2-mana 0/3, so this guy's not combat related at all. When he enters the battlefield, each opponent puts the top 3 cards of his or her library into their graveyard, and Delirium repeats that on your upkeep. So once you've achieved Delirium on your upkeep, or I'm sorry, on your opponent's upkeep, if you have Delirium active, your opponent mills 3 more cards. So first off, this can't target yourself. This has no way to target you. So you can't self-mill with it, which is kind of a problem in this sort of set. Second off, you don't often want to mill your opponent in this format, or at least I'm assuming you don't, just because you're helping them enable their Delirium cards. And third off, like I said, this is a dedicated mill card, and I don't think mill is going to be a super viable strategy. If you have a mill deck, it's probably going to play a couple of these. As many as you can find, in which case it becomes better, but I would avoid this card in any other situation, since it helps your opponent more than it does hurt them. 0/3 body's not really impressing anybody. It's never going to deal damage or trade with a creature, so I would stay away from Menak Scribe. Broken Concentration. 1 blue, so counter target spell. We end up with a cancel here. And Madness for 4. So obvious point here is that the Madness cost is more expensive than the normal cost. So a lot of people are going to be dissuaded by that. First off, the card in general is not good. Cancels are not amazing, especially double blue cancels, because they're harder to cast. I'm not a big fan of counter spells. They are fine when they cost 3 mana and they counter anything. It's not the type of playstyle I like, but some people love counter spells, and this is where you want to be with a counter spell. The Madness here is more of an incentive to use this card as a cost for discarding something. It has to be set up very nicely because this is still a counter spell, so just discarding it at any point is not going to do anything. You really have to set it up so that when your opponent casts a spell, you have some sort of discard enabler that lets you toss this away and use 4 mana on it. You want to be getting some sort of effect from the card you're discarding with. Otherwise, it'd just be better to pay 3 mana for this. I don't love the Madness here. I really don't. I don't think it's that much of an incentive to hold up your mana anyway. And there are very few times where I'm going to be willing to discard this and pay 4 instead of just flat out canceling my opponent's card. I recommend staying away from this unless you're in the market for 3 mana counter spells, which is what this should be used for 90% of the time. Now, Essence Flux. This is the type of card I'm very biased about because I love it. It's a 1 mana instant. Exile target creature you control, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. If it's a spirit, put a 1/1 counter on it. So it's a blink effect. It saves your creatures from removal. It saves them from combat. It can only target your creatures, which is important. You can't exile an opponent's creature. And it has a bonus if that creature is a spirit. I guess spirit kind of has this blinking sub-theme going on in blue-white. But I really love this card. It's very versatile. It does lots of things. It makes your guys bigger if they're spirits, which can be very good on a flyer. If you turn a 3/3 flyer into a 4/4 flyer, that's just a huge difference in my opinion. But the most common use of this is to hold it up until your opponent tries to remove your creature, and then respond by blinking your creature out. Suddenly it's not targeted by that removal anymore. One thing this doesn't help with is board wipes. If your opponent goes to wipe the board, this doesn't wait until the end of turn. It just immediately puts the creature back out. So it's not going to save your creature in that regard, but it will in most others, and I think that makes it worth playing. Erdwall Illuminator is a 2 mana 1/3 flyer. When you investigate for the first time each turn, investigate an additional time. Awesome in multiples. This card seems fantastic. I'm not a huge fan of 1/3 flyers, and I know a lot of people have made the comparison to Makindi Aeronaut in the last set, but the reason Makindi Aeronaut was good in the last set was because it played in with allies, and there was a mechanic that put 1/1 counters on it. It had support to go along with it. 1/3 flyers are much, much better when there's a 1/1 counter theme going on in the set. The same is true for Territorial Lock. rock in Dragons of Tarkir because bolster was in the set, and if you could bolster up your 1/3 flyer, it became an actually very hard to deal with threat. I don't see that going on here, so I'm not so excited about these 1/3 flyers for 2, but Erdwall Illuminator does enough that I would be willing to play in any deck that can investigate and generate clues. This is a pretty sweet ability here on a flyer that can block in the early game and peck in for damage too. It basically, yes, you have to pay mana for those clues, so it's not straight card draw, but it gives you a lot of things to do with your mana, and flooding the field with tokens means that with clue tokens means that you have these extra draws available to you anytime you have 2 extra mana. And I think clues are a little bit better than people are giving them credit for. Of course, we'll have to play it out. Maybe having tons and tons of clues really isn't that important, but I think this guy's highly playable if you have a lot of clues, and he's very filler if you don't have lots of ways to investigate. Fleeting Memories, 3 mana enchantment. This is our dedicated mill card, just like Tutelage. When Fleeting Memories enters the battlefield, you investigate, so you get a clue for playing this. When you sacrifice a clue, target player puts the top 3 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So this card is the backbone of any mill strategy you'll be playing in Limited, and it's essentially mills 3 cards per clue. So you'll have to crack around 8 to 10 clues to mill your opponent out in a normal game. If you're playing a very stalled out game, and if your opponent's playing more card draw than normal, then you can crack less clues to win the game with this. It is similar to Sphinx's Tutelage in that once it gets going, once you're milling cards, it's an actual threat. It's an actual win condition, just because a 40-card deck is not going to be able to put up with an onslaught of mill 3s every turn. I like that this makes other cards a little bit more useful, like Menak Scribe becomes a lot better when you're playing this card to complement the mill strategy. The Vessel of Paramecia becomes a little bit better when you can aim it at your opponent to mill 3. Overall, you need tons of ways to investigate. You're going to need to reliably put clues on the battlefield. I'm looking at you. But if you can get it going and you can reliably sack these clues and wall up the battlefield, then this should be a win condition for you, at least until your opponent brings in the Enchantment Hate in Game 2. Then you're going to need a backup plan. Reckless Scholar gets reprinted, and it's a fine card. It's a 3-mana 2/1. That's not impressing anybody, but it's a good loot. Tap, target player draws a card, then discards a card. For the purposes of Two-Headed Giant, this can target your partner as well. They draw, then discard. It's target player, not just you, but this is good looters. This is how a looter wants to look, and I think the idea is it got bumped up to uncommon because it is a madness enabler. Does not require a mana investment to loot. And it's a good loot. It draws the card before discarded. Very good madness enabler, as you'll be able to increase the size of your hand and then toss a card away. This is the type of card you want to get down on turn 3 and start looting with if you need to or have the option to. And the fact that you can do this on your opponent's turn makes your madness cards instant speed if they're normally sorcery cards. So being able to madness out a card on your opponent's turn gives it just that much more value. Again, not really an incentive to play overpriced counter spells, but do what you will with Reckless Scholar. It's a fine card without madness. It's a great card with madness. Stitchwing Scab is a 4-mana 3/1 flyer. 1 and a blue. Discard 2 cards. Return it from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So, again, madness and delirium. More delirium than madness, I suppose, since this costs you mana plus you're discarding multiple cards. But 3 power of flying for 4 mana is a pretty big threat, and especially when you can recur it in the late game, you don't want to just dump your hand to put this back on the battlefield because it is a little fragile at 1 toughness, but this card can get you there. The only time I don't love this card is when your opponent's playing lots of 1/1 spirit tokens, in which case they can just chump this guy and trade all day. You're not going to want to discard 2 cards over and over again unless they're absolutely insane madness cards. But if they're just value cards like the filter 2, then that gets a lot worse. But if you're doing things with the discard on this, or you're making it so that it affects your delirium count, I think this card's great. And I would play it just as a 4-mana 3/1 flyer, even if I never had to recur it. Trail of Evidence, another enchantment for 3 mana. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, investigate. So, kind of a kicker cost. It might as well say, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, pay 2 mana, draw a card, something like that. It's not the exact same, but you get the point. This works very well with cards that want you to investigate. We saw a couple in blue already. The mill card, the 1/3 flyer. The more times you investigate, the better those cards get. Of course, you need to be casting instants and sorceries for this to work. It won't do anything the turn it comes down. There are times it just sits there and doesn't do anything, kind of like Jasus Sanctum from Origins. Cards that care about instants or sorceries being cast may not do anything if you're not playing instants or sorceries, but this fits into certain decks, and then it's very cuttable from other decks. It's not a card I love, but it gives you value off casting your spells, and maybe you love that more than I do. So do with it what you will, and let me know how it works out for you. Rise from the Tides, 6 mana sorcery. Put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield tapped for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. Alright, so this is kind of another finisher for blue to get. It can generate a ton of tokens. If you have 3 instants or sorceries when you cast this, you're adding 6 power to the board, which I think is the minimum that you want to cast this. It won't count itself because it won't be in the graveyard when you cast it. It gets better in multiples, obviously, but one downside is that the creatures come in tapped, so you can't use them right away. The upside that is that if you cast this with enough instants and sorceries in your graveyard, if you untap with those zombies, you're probably going to win the game. This has the potential to generate a ton of zombie tokens, depending on how the game's played out. It plays very well with self-mill. It plays very well with just casting instants and sorceries. If you can pull this off for, I think, 4, 5, 6 plus, you should win the game with those tokens. It just adds lots of power for one card. Compelling Deterrence, a 2-mana instant, return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Then that player discards a card if you control a zombie. So I already gave some praise towards 2-mana bounce spells. This is that plus everything else you want it to be. First off, it can bounce non-land permanents, not just creatures. So if your opponent has an enchantment that is really messing you up or really giving them an advantage, you can use this to bounce it back. Most of the time it'll be on creatures, but the options are there. The second part, if you control a zombie, your opponent discards a card, makes this card absolutely fantastic if you control a zombie. It goes from good, playable, to absolutely incredible. For 2 mana, getting rid of a threat off the field, plus making your opponent discard is very good, and it becomes even better when your opponent doesn't have any cards in hand, because it means that they have to discard the card that you bounce back. I will play as many of these as I can get. If I'm in a zombie deck, I will be looking to first or second pick them. I think the card is that good, and the base being just a bounce spell for 2 makes it that much more appealing. Pour Over the Pages is a 5-mana sorcery. Draw 3 cards, untap 2 lands, then discard a card. So this is looking to really enable your madness cards. First off, you get 3 cards for this, which is awesome. You're going to discard 1, so you're up 2, but the filtering's fine. Hopefully you're discarding a madness card, so it's kind of essentially just draw 3 and then cast a card from your hand. The fact that this untaps 2 lands before you discard the card means that you're probably going to have the mana available to activate the madness on whatever card you discard. If you're just using this to dump a card and you're not really getting value off of it, then so be it. This is still good card filtering. Draw 3, discard a card is okay. Plus it gives you that 2 mana back to do whatever you need it with it. I think I would happily play at least one of these. I don't want to go overboard because it is a 5-mana draw spell, but I think it's a great card. Invasive Surgery, 1 mana blue. instant. Counter target sorcery spell. Summary of the Delirium is if you have Delirium, you then get rid of all other copies of that spell from your opponent's graveyard, hand, and library. Yada, yada, yada. This card is absolutely terrible for limited. Say what you will about it in constructed, but Warp and Well never saw play as a counter target sorcery, and I doubt this will either. Also, the part that she's holding in her hand seems much smaller than it would have to be to go on top of that brain, but I'm not going to talk about that. Anyway, countering a sorcery spell is not worth a card in your library because your opponent may not have sorceries. It gets a little bit better out of the sideboard against like blue matchups where, as we've seen, there are tons of blue sorceries, but I'm not impressed with this card and I would almost never play it. Alright, moving along into the rare category, so we're wrapping up here. Welcome to the Fold is a 4-mana double blue. The effect here is gain control of target creature if its toughness is 2 or less. So right there, that's a little bit wonky. Your opponent plays a 3/3, you can't do much about it, but the fact is, when you gain control of an opponent's creature, you're essentially using a removal spell plus a creature spell on your side of the field. So it's fine even if you're taking something a little bit smaller. Now, this gets really interesting because it has Madness for X and double blue, and it says, if Welcome to the Fold's Madness cost was paid, instead gain control of that creature if its toughness is X or less. So you're looking to Madness this card out. If you can discard it, then you can pay double blue and X. For instance, if you pay 5 mana total, X will be 3, and you can take a creature with toughness 3 or less, and it scales up from there. You do have to find a reliable way to discard this, and you should find a way to discard it without using your mana. So a free discard spell, for instance, Reckless Scholar, so that you have more mana to invest into X, you can take bigger creatures with it. This is a card that starts at a kind of low floor and is fine there, and scales up and gets more powerful the more mana you have and the better your discard enablers are. This card is great. If I'm in blue, I'm taking it every time. Rattle Chains. This card, I love cards like this. I absolutely do. But a 2-mana 2/1 flyer with flash is already fantastic. We saw a bunch of 2/1 flyers in Battle for Zendikar and Oath of the Gatewatch, and they were all pretty good in their own respect. Rattle Chains enters the battlefield. Target spirit gains hexproof until end of turn, and you may cast spirit spells as though they had flash. Now, this is your lord for spirits. It's supposed to play well with blue-white spirits, and it plays very well with them. A lot of times you'll play this out, and you'll just start pecking with it, 2 damage starting on turn 2. If you draw it later in the game, it becomes a protection spell against targeted removal, as you can flash this in response to a removal spell if it's targeting a spirit and fizzle out that removal spell. And that last part is very nice. If you are going really hard with the spirits, you've got a ton of them in your deck, being able to flash those creatures out is amazing. I think Rattle Chains is absolutely fantastic. It's the type of card I would take in the first pack and then look to build spirits. I would almost force spirits for this card, and if you can get multiples, you're pretty much GG. But I like that this does quite a bit for one card, and it helps the rest of your deck out if you manage to go tribal with it. Forgotten Creation is a 4-mana 3/3 with Skulk. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may discard all the cards in your hand. If you do, draw that many cards. So this card seems very good. First off, Skulk is a little bit worse the stronger the creature gets. So Skulk, it's kind of weird because it means that your opponent's not going to be able to just eat this up with a bigger creature, so it might be able to get in there. But it also means that your opponent's going to lose smaller creatures to it. The best way to deal with a Skulk creature like a 3/3 is to block with another 3/3. Otherwise, it's just eating up smaller creatures or getting past the bigger creatures. But again, the higher the power on Skulk gets, or the higher power a creature with Skulk has, I think the worse Skulk gets. I may be wrong about that. Maybe I'm misevaluating it. But the ability here, that's what you're looking at, right? It's a zombie, but you're looking at the ability. On your upkeep, you may discard all the cards in your hand and then draw that many cards. If you're just sitting on a bunch of junkers or you've saved up a bunch of lands, you've used out all the tricks in your hand, throw your hand away, get a new hand. That is fantastic ability. You don't want to use this every turn all the time because you will mill yourself out, but this lets you reload on gas, assuming you're not holding gas already. It is a May ability as well, so you don't have to do it. And it triggers on your upkeep, so that's before you draw the card for your turn. So you always have the option to get rid of the cards you know are going to be garbage instead of drawing a card and then accidentally getting rid of it or something like that. Forgotten Creation seems like a fantastic first pickable blue card. Engulf the Shore, 4 mana, instant. Return to their owner's hands all creatures with toughness less than or equal to the number of islands you control. So obviously this gets better the more blue you are. This gets better the less creatures you're playing. Or this gets better the more high toughness blue cards you're playing, I guess. There's not a lot of control over this. Once you've played your islands out, that affects the way this card is going to work. The thing that makes me want to take this card, and the thing that I think justifies it being a rare, is that it's an instant. The last card like this I remember was Displacement Wave from Origins, and that was a sorcery, and that made all the difference. It was nearly unplayable because your opponent was the one who got to play all their creatures out first. Engulf the Shore means that you can use this at the end step of your opponent's turn and bounce everything back to their hands, or bounce the most significant creatures back to their hands, and you're the one who gets first advantage of that. Obviously, if your opponent has a huge toughness creature, this gets worse. If you have a huge toughness creature, it gets better, but a lot of times this is just going to reset the creatures on the board. It also wipes tokens, which is a nice little plus side, but not a busted rare, but a good one, I think, and I'd be happy to take it in my blue decks. Confirm Suspicions, 5 mana counterspell. Counter target spell, investigate 3 times. So this seems like garbage to me. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe investigating 3 times is that good, but that's an extra 6 mana to draw 3 cards, essentially, making this 11 mana total to get the full effect of the card. This gets a lot better if you are doing something that cares about investigating or doing something that cares about having clue tokens. This is a lot worse if you're just using it as a counterspell with some late game draw. This card, I was very surprised to see this was rare, and I would pass it most of the time, I think. 5 mana is not where I want to be with a counterspell. Epiphany at the Drownyard is X in blue. For an instant, reveal the top X plus 1 cards of your library and separate them into 2 piles. An opponent chooses one of those piles. Put that pile into your hand and the other into your graveyard. So it's X plus 1. If I pay a total of 2 mana for this card, 1 for X, 1 for blue, I flip over 2 cards. So I think you want to pay an odd number for X most of the time. That way you have even piles. Because a lot of times your opponent will just give you the pile with less cards, depending on what they are, of course. The real catch here is that your opponent gets to pick the pile. You get to separate them. So you hit a bunch of bombs, you're not going to put them in the same pile, obviously, but your opponent gets to choose kind of the worst option for you. A lot of times this is still in your advantage. It's still going to draw you cards, even if they're not the most ideal cards out of the piles. You're still going to get cards from this, and the more you pay for X, the more cards you're going to get. The rest go to the graveyard too, so you get all the delirium, yada yada yada, blah blah blah. So I think this card is still playable. It gives your opponent the option, which is usually not a good sign, but I think this card is still fine otherwise. I don't think it's great. I don't think it's absolutely amazing, but the later in the game it is, the more cards you get. So it scales in power, and I think that makes it worth picking. Natalia Moondrakes. This is a 7 mana, 5/5 flyer. When she or he or it enters the battlefield, target creature gains flying until end of turn. And then for 6 mana, if this guy's sitting in your graveyard, you can exile him from your graveyard. All of your creatures gain flying until end of turn. Bingo on the last ability. Just having that ability while this card is in the graveyard makes it a huge threat. Being able to turn an entire field of creatures into flyers can be game-ending in a lot of situations. the fact that this comes in and it gives you value right off the bat by letting you kind of jump another creature and smash with it, I think makes this card pretty good. Obviously, this is the type of card that, had it not had that last ability, it'd be very meh, and I still don't think this card is like a huge bomb or anything, but I think it's very good. I think if you're in blue, you're playing it, and it supports your self-mill strategies by giving you value out of the graveyard, should you not be able to cast it from your hand. Also, the type of card you might be okay discarding in certain situations if you know that that last ability might be able to win you the game on certain boards. So I think Natalia Moondrakes is a first pickable card. It's not so expensive that it'll wheel around the table. Somebody's bound to take it, and it will win games every now and then, so I think it's fine. Thinking the Ice is a very intriguing card. This is a 2-mana 0/4 Defender. It enters the battlefield with 4 ice counters. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you remove an ice counter, and if it has no ice counters on it, you transform it into Awoken Horror, a 7/8 Kraken Horror creature. When he transforms, you return all non-horror creatures to their owner's hands. There's a lot to talk about with this card. I'm making a whole separate video for it, spoiler alert, but look at the base first. You need lots of instants and sorceries to make this work. It gets a lot worse in the late game when you've already drawn tons of your instants or sorceries. So this is ideally a 2-drop followed up by a bunch of instants or sorceries. It plays very well with counter spells because they will remove an ice counter while also protecting your board. And the fact is, if you transform this, you've probably won the game. Earlier when I mentioned 2-mana bounce spells being very ideal against certain cards, this is what I had in mind. If your opponent transforms this, and they think they're going to win the game with it, you can always bounce it back, and then it's very likely not going to flip again, since they'll have to play it and go through another 4 instants or sorceries. But barring that situation, this card will win you the game. It bounces all non-horror creatures, and I wasn't really paying attention to horrors throughout this review, but a lot of blue creatures are horrors, and there are a couple others scattered throughout other colors. So 95% of the time, this will bounce the entire board. That other 5%, there might be a horror laying around, and it might be yours, so it might get even better. But this will reset the field while also letting you bash for 7 over and over again. The body on this is just not going to be burned out. It's not going to be traded in combat normally, so your opponent's going to have to find a way to deal with it. And I think if you play Thing in the Ice and you start removing those counters, your opponent's going to aim everything they can at this card to remove it from the field before it gets to the point where it flips. So Thing in the Ice, there's a lot to talk about. If you're interested, look out for my video on it, but I think this card's amazing. Moving into the Mythics, I believe we have 3 blue Mythics here, and then we're done. Giraffe's Masterpiece. This is a 5-mana flyer, a 7/7 zombie horror, so the base is awesome. Now, he loses -1/-1 for each card in your hand, so if you play this on turn 5, you might still have 2, 3, even 4 cards in your hand, so he's going to be a little bit smaller than a 7/7. If you play him out as the last card in your hand, then, well, you've got a 7/7 flyer. Congratulations, you've got a 3-turn clock. So he weakens the more cards you have in your hand. Worth noting, definitely puts a damper on the power level of this card. An additional ability here, for 4 mana, you can discard 3 cards, return him from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So he comes in tapped, but since you're discarding 3 cards, he's likely going to come back in as a 7/7, if not a very powerful flyer. This card is great. It's got a little Gerald up here, I believe, is what that's supposed to be. So there you go, people who are looking for Gerald. I think this card is good. I don't know if it's mythic quality. I don't know how this card is going to work until I actually play with it or play against it. I'm the type of person who likes to keep answers in my hand, who likes to have a lot of cards in my hand. So the more cards I have, the weaker this card gets. But at the same time, a 7/7 flyer is pretty much unparalleled as far as flyers go, and this card can win you the game very quickly. So the incentive to discard your cards is counteractive with the incentive to hold on to cards for answers. I'm excited to play with this card just because I think it's unique and encourages different play styles. But I think it's powerful is the bottom line, and I think you will play in your blue decks, regardless of how tense you are about holding cards up or not. Next mythic here is a flip card, sorcery flip card. This is 4 mana for a sorcery. Target opponent puts the top 13 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. 13, keep in mind, this is limited. We're not talking about constructed. 13 is essentially half the opponent's deck. A 40-card deck cannot handle 13 cards repetitively. Now, what this does on top of it is, for 5 mana, you can put Startled Awake from your graveyard onto the battlefield transformed. Activate this ability only anytime you can cast a sorcery. So the idea here is you cast the card, you mill 13, and then when you have 5 mana open, at sorcery speed, you can then put the flip side of this onto the battlefield, and you get Persistent Nightmare. This is a 1/1 Skulk. When Persistent Nightmare deals combat damage to a player, return it to its owner's hand. So 1/1 Skulks are very likely to get in. They can only be blocked by 1-power creatures. So if your opponent does not have a 1-power creature, well, too bad. Nightmare's getting in there. If they kill it, you can pay the mana cost again and put it back onto the battlefield. If this deals damage, it goes back to your hand. The only way to stop this is really to exile it, or to have a 1/1 that can block. Otherwise, if they get this card back even once, it's pretty much game over. Milling 13 cards is pretty bad, but you can still come back from it. Milling 26 will end the game. That gives you about 7 turns, assuming your opponent can cast this twice, and you kept a 7-card hand for this to beat you. This will beat you on 2 activations most of the time. It is very mana intensive. It costs 4 to play. It costs 5 to flip it. It's going to cost another 4 to play again, but that should be enough to win you the game. Again, this is the type of card that encourages walling up. For instance, 1/5 flyers for 4. Cards that are very hard to get through and give you time to cast this over and over again. Again, 2 activations of this card should be enough to win the game. And one neat thing is when it's flipped up, you can actually use a bounce spell, return it to your hand, and then not have to go through the trouble of paying the extra mana or getting through with it. You can just cast it from Startled Awake again. This deserves to be a mythic. It does not need to come up in games very often, and it will but win most games that it gets cast in. And finally, we have a mono blue planeswalker. Excuse me, Jace, Unraveler of Secrets. The comparison has already been made to Obnixilis. They're very, very similar planeswalkers. But let's look at Jace. +1, scry 1, then draw a card. So if you plus this, the turn it comes out, you're at 6 loyalty. Your opponent's going to have some trouble killing Jace off. But that's a good ability. Scry 1, then draw a card. If it was just +1, draw a card, it'd be awesome. But giving you that selection adds another layer to it that makes it even better. -2, return target creature to its owner's hand. Very similar to Obnixilis' -3, but not permanent removal. The plus side here is that you can -2 multiple times without Jace dying. You could go -2, and if they replay something, you can go -2 again. You can't do that with Obnixilis. You can only -3 once before you have to start plussing. Finally, -8, you get an emblem with whenever an opponent casts his or her first spell each turn, counter that spell. So it's going to pretty much mess up your opponent's ability to play spells reliably. Should win you the game. But Jace, played along with any sort of tempo strategy, anything that can attack, should win you the game anyway. An extra card when you need it, and a bounce spell when you need it, plus multiple bounce spells in a row, makes it very hard to kind of race with Jace. The downside is if you play Jace and it's really the only thing you've got going on for you, your opponent's got a board and you're just behind, this Planeswalker might not do it for you. He might just die very quickly. But if you can play him on curve or you can play him with the board presence to back him up, he'll win you the game. An extra card per turn is not anything to scoff at. And that -2 ability alternates very well with the plus. You can use him offensively or defensively. And similar to Obnixilis, he's not unbeatable but very strong and fits into his color extremely well. So that's all I've got for the blue. Again, I know these videos go long, so if you're still watching or you watched up to this point, I really appreciate it. Again, I would love your comments, your feedback. Blue doesn't seem absolutely impressive. It didn't have a lot of things that just said wow to me, but it does have some cool things going on. Lots of investigate, some pseudo mill cards, and lots of ways to kind of get your delirium going is what I'm seeing for blue. But let me know what you think. Anything you'd agree with, anything you disagree with. I'll be back with the next color soon enough, and I thank you guys for watching, so see you next.